Good afternoon. I'm Professor John Fischetti, Pro-Vice Chancellor of the College of Human and Social Futures at the University of Newcastle. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this beautiful venue, the Conservatory of Music, located in the heart of our CBD campus of our wonderful university. This is the inaugural lecture of the university's Asia Pacific Research Center, and we're proud to be co-hosting this with our friends at the Newcastle Institute. We're so delighted that you're able to join us today as one of our most esteemed leaders of Australian history, our keynote presenter, the Honourable Dr. Kevin Rudd, AC, 26th Prime Minister of Australia. Welcome, Dr. Rudd. As we gather on beautiful Awabakal and Worimi land this afternoon, I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders of the past and present. We're honored to have Auntie Donna Meehan join us, who will shortly offer the formal acknowledgement of country. Welcome, Auntie Donna. We also have several special guests here today, and I'd really like to warmly welcome Mr. Tim Krakenthorpe, MP, Member for Newcastle and Shadow Minister for Tertiary Education, Skills and TAFE. Nuatali Nelms, Lord Mayor of the City of Newcastle. Declan Clausen, Deputy Lord Mayor of the City of Newcastle. Jeremy Bath, CEO of the City of Newcastle. Mr. Greg Warren, MP, Member for Campbelltown, Shadow Minister for Local Government, Veterans and Western Sydney. Former Members of Parliament, Sharon Gerson, and the Honourable John Price, AM. Mr. Robert Logan from the Newcastle Institute, who will be hosting today's conversation with Dr. Rudd following the lecture. University Council members, executive, staff, and students. Members of the alumni and broader community, both here in the Conservatorium and for those of you watching from home on the live stream. Thank you all for joining us. A quick note of safety to begin. In the unlikely instance that we might need to evacuate, please make your way to your nearest exit on either side of the hall or at the rear of the building. Our security and event team will safely guide you to the evacuation point at the beautiful and green Civic Park directly across the road from the Conservatorium. Getting back to our event, today's program will explore the themes of Dr. Rudd's latest book, The Avoidable War. Through his analysis, Dr. Rudd considers the relationship between China, the United States, and its allies, and how a conflict between superpowers might be prevented. The tides of these relationships are of great significance to the economic and national security of countries throughout the Asia Pacific. It's an especially timely topic for those of us to consider what's happened just in the last week as the diplomatic ties between Beijing and Canberra begin to thaw. And we saw that at the G20 summit. It's a different kind of climate change, and it's one that could be good. The exploration of issues of relevance to our region, like those that we will hear today, are the focus of our hosts at the Asia Pacific Research Center and the Newcastle Institute. The regional center, led by our own Professor Frank Agbola from the College of Human and Social Futures, aims to improve our understanding of the Asia Pacific through multidisciplinary and culturally responsive research and events like this. Similarly, the Newcastle Institute is an independent forum that promotes the discussion of diverse ideas in public policy and political discourse, both here in Newcastle and beyond. After today's keynote presentation, Mr. Robert Logan from the Institute will lead a conversation with Dr. Rudd. Many of you know that Mr. Logan's career in education spans over 30 years. He's held positions including teacher and lecturer through to senior executive roles. He's been a member of numerous local, state, and national boards and advisory committees, including for universities. His areas of interest include education, health, Australia's relationship with China, and cross-cultural leadership. With this shared purpose, we are proud to be co-hosting this inaugural lecture and to bring our community together to learn more about these critical issues. To have a keynote speaker of Dr. Rudd's distinction, a respected authority on this topic with 40 years of experience in national leadership, is a real privilege for us and our region, and I'm sure you're eagerly awaiting Dr. Rudd's thoughts and insights. To get things underway, we're delighted to have Auntie Donna Meehan with us to deliver a formal acknowledgement of country. Following Auntie Donna's acknowledgement, Professor Alex Zielinski, AO, Vice Chancellor and President of the University of Newcastle, will introduce our guest of honor. Auntie Donna is a proud Gamilaroi woman and leader in our community. She's a broadcaster, author, and speaker. and she's an inspiring advocate and voice for Aboriginal Australians, including those of the stolen generation. We are honored that she could join us for their event and to offer an acknowledgement of country. Please welcome Auntie Donna Meehan.
Good afternoon, Yama Dr. Rudd. Thank you for the invite to come and share this afternoon. I'm very honoured and privileged. I'd like to acknowledge that we're living, learning, working on the land of the Wabakal and Warramai nations. Pay my respect to the elders, past and present. I believe in the resilience of all Aboriginal people. Newcastle is a place of hope and opportunities. I was brought here when I was 5 from Coonamble. I'm a Gamilaroi woman, and I was fostered, adopted, educated, married, and have worked with the Awabakal people for 35 years in various government departments. The dreaming story for Awabakal is the big kangaroo that jumped from Nobbies across to Stockton. The totem is the sea eagle. And we have so many inspiring Indigenous people in this town, high achievers, and it's a pleasure to work with them. In Kath Walker's poem, The Past, she talks about this moment of time, this present now. And so we stand on history today. From my 14-year-old grandson, who said Dr. Rudd was the best Prime Minister we had, and to thank him for saying sorry, having a national apology. It took a big man to say that. And I was there that day with 2 brothers, and there was a shake, there was a shift in the atmosphere, not only in Canberra, but we travelled the next day from New South Wales to Queensland, and the shift was amazing, so thank you. We look forward to hearing this next chapter of your life, Dr. Rudd. It'll be so insightful and timely, and so thank you. Have a great afternoon, and as we listen in silence, we're actually showing respect, so thank you for your respect.
Thank you, Auntie Donna. That was very heartfelt sharing your story with us, and it's great to have you with us here today. I know you especially have connections with Dr. Rudd, so thank you very much. This is a wonderful occasion for our university. It's terrific to see so many people here and online. I'm particularly pleased to have students from local high schools here today, so welcome. And hopefully you get inspired to think about coming to university and hearing great talks like the one you're going to hear coming up. And I'd also like to extend acknowledgements to our various VIPs who are here today, so thank you very much for your support of the university. And also extend sincere thanks to our hosts, the Asia Pacific Research Centre and the Newcastle Institute. The audience maybe noticed that we've been referring to our guest as Dr. Rudd. We have to extend congratulations to Dr. Rudd for being awarded his Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford University after submitting his 420-page thesis on President Xi Jinping's worldview. So congratulations, Dr. Rudd. So I can say now you're qualified to lecture at the university. But also, I want to make sure that to say that, Dr. Rudd, I think you'll feel home here at the University of Newcastle, as we value equity and excellence, which I know are very important to you. Dr. Rudd came from humble beginnings, raised on a farm in Queensland. Many of our students come from similar backgrounds. 50% of our students are first in their family to attend university, and about a quarter come from low socio-economic backgrounds. 4.2% of our students are Indigenous, and 3% are of our staff. In spite of these diverse backgrounds, 90% of our students are employed within 4 months of graduating, third highest percentage in the country. So we're a university that looks outward to the world. We're home to the Australia's only United Nations Institute for Training and Research, and the first in the Asia-Pacific region through our Centre-Newcastle Institute. The Institute focuses on disaster management and emergency response, particularly in the Pacific. Last year, our university was named #1 in the world for partnering on more sustainable future under the UN Sustainability Development Goals. And now to our guest of honour, the Honourable Dr. Kevin Rudd, AC, 26th Prime Minister of Australia. Prior to entering politics, Dr. Rudd completed a Bachelor of Arts in Asian Studies with first-class honours at the Australian National University. He became fascinated with China, which led for him to work with the Department of Foreign Affairs as a diplomat in Stockholm and Beijing. Upon his return to Australia, he became the Chief of Staff to Wayne Goss, the Queensland Premier in the election campaign of 1989. He then took on the role of Director General of the Cabinet of Office during the Goss government. In 1998, Dr. Rudd won his first seat in Parliament, that of Griffith in the southeast Brisbane. He became the leader of the Australian Labor Party in 2006 and went on to win the 2007 federal election. While he was Prime Minister, he championed major reforms in health, education, industrial relations, social security and infrastructure. Among his many achievements in office, he was instrumental in standing up the National Broadband Network, and I had the pleasure of writing the recommendation for him around that at the time when I was working at CSIRO. But I just think back with the pandemic, where would we be without the NBN? Certainly we were very much reliant on online education here at the university to steer us through it. Without an NBN, it would have been impossible. So thank you for your foresight, Dr. Rudd. Additionally, he led through Australia through the global financial crisis, and the International Monetary Fund called his approach the most effective stimulus strategy of all major economies, making Australia the only developed economy not to go into recession. As Auntie Donna mentioned, on February 13th, 2008, Dr. Rudd delivered the national apology to the stolen generations in Australia, a landmark moment in our nation's history. He also supported many inclusive education measures, beginning with the education revolution that started on his watch. And I might add that while he was Prime Minister the second time, he also championed a grant for our university, for the Newcastle Institute of Energy and Resources as it transitioned from BHP closure. So that institute, NEAR, as we call it today, is, I would say, Australia's leading research institute in energy and resources. And so thank you for your foresight there again, Dr. Rudd. Since leaving politics in 2013, Dr. Rudd has held numerous distinguished positions. He serves as Chair of the Sanitation and Water for All and Chair of the International Peace Institute. He founded Australians for the Murdoch Royal Commission, which advocates for an independent public inquiry on Australian media ownership. As co-chair of the National Apology Foundation, Dr. Rudd champions reconciliation. He's also served as President and CEO of the Asia Society, as well as President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. We're honoured to have him to deliver the inaugural lecture of this Asia Pacific Research Centre and Newcastle Institute. Please warmly welcome the Honourable Dr. Kevin Rudd, AC.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for that very warm welcome back to this great city of Newcastle. And thank you also, Auntie Donna, for the marvellous welcome to country. I well remember the day of the apology, and I remember speaking to families, Indigenous families, who took the long drive back from Canberra to Brisbane along the Newell Highway the day after the apology. And when they were driving down the Newell several days before to come to the apology, they told me a story of how, when they pulled up for fuel, that they were on the receiving end of the usual glances. Little more needs to be said. Then several days later, they came back through the same town. They stopped and they went into the cafe one of those old-style cafes which people of a certain age in this gathering will remember. The booths up the side. They came in, Aboriginal family of 4, and there were, in their telling of the story, 7 or 8 other people already in the cafe, some sitting at the booths, some sitting or standing at the counter, and of course those serving as well. The room went quiet, and they said, "Oh my God, here it comes again." But the day after the apology, what happened was all the white folks in the cafe in that small country town on the Newell stood up and applauded, our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. The national apology didn't solve everything, but it helped us turn a corner. And still there is much to be done, through voice, through recognition, and through treaty. To other members of the University of Newcastle Council and the University Executive, to colleagues from the Asia Pacific Research Centre, members of the Newcastle Institute, as well as Tim Krakenthorpe, the State Member for Newcastle, Nuatali Nelms, the Lord Mayor of the City of Newcastle, Declan Clausen, the Deputy Mayor, Jeremy Bath, the CEO, Sharon Grierson. Where are you, Sharon? Former Federal Member for Newcastle. Friend and parliamentary colleague, thank you for your years of service here. The Honourable John Price, former member of the New South Wales Legislative Assembly for Maitland. Greg Warren, MP, a friend of mine, member for Campbelltown. Mate, you took a wrong turn somewhere. Don't know what you're doing in Newcastle, it's down that way, but good to have you here. And to all of you who are students here at this great Australian university, the University of Newcastle, and those of you who will come here to study soon, I bring you greetings. It's good to be back in Newcastle. I've been here many, many times over the years. And I've got to say, having come this time, I said to Nuatali this morning, the Mayor, this city's looking really good. I've seen it in times in the past, but it hasn't looked quite as sharp. But I've got to say, the Mayor, backed up by local members and others, a great job's been done here in turning this city around. It's a highly attractive place to come, to be, to visit, and to have time to stay and to work. So well done, Mayor, and to those around you. And coming from regional Queensland as I do, I have a real big interest in what happens in that large slab of Australia which exists right outside our metropolitan centres. And for the University of Newcastle itself, I've been talking to Alex, the Vice-Chancellor, about the achievements of this university. When you're looking at 26,000 full-time student equivalents, some 39,000 students overall, 2 major research institutes, one in health and the other in renewable energy technology. These are not small achievements for a university located here in Newcastle and one of Australia's 10 leading universities. So to those who have been in stewardship positions for this great academic institution, again, my heartfelt congratulations. When we look at our country writ large, I see at this stage us as standing on the threshold of great global and national challenges, which, if we're not careful in how we navigate them, we could, in fact, be overwhelmed by them. There is the great geopolitical challenge of China and its rise under Xi Jinping, and its competition strategically, perhaps one day evolving into conflict with the United States of America, affecting us all. When I look here on our shores at home, I see our economy in need of comprehensive reform and renewal so that we embrace all the major drivers of the economic growth of the future through the major new driving technologies of semiconductors, of artificial intelligence, of supercomputing, of quantum computing, as well as renewable energy, the life sciences, nanomaterials. or whether those new technologies pass our economy by as others are driven forward by them. I think of a third challenge, which is how do we maintain our great Australian social fabric? I remember coming to this town as Prime Minister with Sharon, actually, to launch officially the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the NDIS, in 2013. Now, there may have been some maladministration of it in recent years, but when I look at the core question of ensuring that we have a social contract which provides people with decency of life, equality of opportunity, and a humane safety net for those who run into one of life's great brick walls, unless we preserve that social contract, and I fear we do end up like America, where for the last 7 years I have lived and worked and had my being. A fourth challenge is existential for you here in the Hunter and for all of us, and that is wrestling to the ground the great challenge of climate change, doing it in a way whereby we can transition effectively and intelligently over time while saving the planet, keeping temperature increases this century within 1.5 degrees centigrade. Otherwise, we do perish. And the signs of extreme weather events are there for all communities now to see across the world and across Australia. And the fifth one that I see, which if we don't address will overwhelm us all, is to keep alive the vitality of our democracy itself. This is no small thing, but part of that vitality lies in having sufficient diversity in our national media and not allowing there to be a monopoly of our media by any particular group, let alone one group in particular, beginning with the letter M. Now, democracy is this quite delicate flower. It's blown about in the wind. And one of its nutrients is the freedom of the press and an appropriate and balanced dissemination of news and a complete diversity of opinion surrounding that news. And I worry deeply when fact and opinion become conflated to the point that they distort utterly the arteries of our democracy and the free flow of news to all communities through which our citizens can then make informed decisions for the future. And that is why I have established with pride Australians from Murdoch Royal Commission. These 5 challenges that I've just listed cover the fabric, if you like, of our economy, our society, our democracy, as well as our sustainability and the geopolitical environment in which we now find ourselves. And on geopolitics itself, the topic I have come here to address today is how do we avoid war between China and the United States? It is easy to say something like that as if it falls neatly off one's lips. But to think for a moment about what such a war would look like is a terrifying thing. There is nobody really in this room who I think can remember the devastation of the Second World War. My father was a serviceman. And there's certainly no one here who can remember the devastation of the First World War, where after an assassination in an obscure town by an obscure individual against an archduke of an obscure empire that nobody had ever heard of in this part of the world, then left 60,000 Australian servicemen dead 4 years later, and hundreds of thousands maimed and wounded among 60 million across the world. Wars start from small things, and then they have a habit of escalating. And if we would apply that prism to what could unfold across the Taiwan Straits between China and the United States, there is no such thing as a limited war. There is no such thing as a small war. The interests at stake are so large between these two superpowers of the 21st century, the two largest economies of the 21st century, that the initiation of hostilities rapidly escalates to becoming a general war. The loss of life on Taiwan itself would be massive. The loss of life by servicemen on all sides would be massive. The sheer destruction of the global economy as all commerce grinds to a halt is such that it would plunge the global economy into depression. The arteries of trade would dry up, foreign and domestic investment flows would stop, international travel would also grind to a halt. And in terms of who wins in the end, you cannot rule out the possibility that a war would exclusively be fought with conventional weapons if one side reaches extremists. And in the case of China, run by the Chinese Communist Party, which is a revolutionary party organised on Leninist principles, the idea of military defeat and its existential consequences for the future of the party itself, you could not rule out whether in fact the command is then issued to make recourse to weapons of mass destruction in order to preserve China's and the party's interests. The stakes, therefore, my friends, are very large. I don't exaggerate them. Usually at this stage they're buried in technical papers being produced by the US National War College or the Chinese National Defense University, or by the sorts of academics with whom I work now as chair and president of a think tank based in the United States. But translated into our daily language, we would find ourselves on the cusp of the most destructive war since the end of the Second World War, which is why we should be straining every sinew, every effort, every ounce of our creative imagination to avoid that war. I'm a bit old-fashioned. I kind of like peace. I know not everyone thinks that way. There are certain hairy-chested politicians in this country who shall remain nameless. They come from Queensland. Some of them may be follically challenged. But I'm in the peace faction, which is we should be straining every possible sinew in the direction of preserving the peace. Not peace at any price, not peace through appeasement, but peace through effective deterrence of war. Some ask, how have we got to this point? When I look at the current state of US-China relations, which I've been studying for the last 40 years, it's the first time that I have become anxious about where this relationship was going. It was in freefall, in a manner which I had not seen since Nixon first set foot on Chinese soil back in 1972. That's a long time ago. That's half a century ago. So why have we got to this stage? I think there are three driving factors which we should focus on in a conversation such as this. One is the balance of power. Whether we like it or not, the realist view of international relations, anchored in the national security establishments of both the United States and the People's Republic of China, look very carefully at the evolving physical balance of military, technological, financial, economic power between these two countries against the possibility of a future crisis, conflict, and war. And that balance has been changing. Slowly at first in the last decade of the last century, more rapidly in the first 2 decades of this century, so that we approach a point across the Taiwan Straits when various levels of parity seem to be being achieved. Militarily, China has caught up. In some weapons categories it's more advanced, in others it is not. Economically, the Chinese economy on one measure is already the largest in the world, on a different measure it's the second largest. Technologically, if you look at the 10 principal categories of priority technologies, starting with semiconductors and ending with renewables, the Chinese would say that they're ahead in several, the Americans would say they're ahead in most, and the race is on in earnest. But is the fact that there are now changes in this balance of power, whereas 20 or 30 years the Americans were vastly ahead in all these categories, which actually shapes the shift in the underpinning firmament of this relationship. The second driving force in the current state of the US-China relationship is the fact that Xi Jinping, China's president, general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party and chairman of the Central Military Commission, has changed China's national strategy as of about 2012-2013. In the good old days of Deng Xiaoping's axiom to the world for China was to subvert China's foreign and security policy interests to the overwhelming priority and centrality of economic development. And that was China's mantra for the better part of 30 to 35 to 40 years. From the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee of the Communist Party back in 1978, through until the 19th Party Congress in 2017, or thereabouts. And Deng's maxim was pretty clear. He said, we're sick and tired of debating theory and ideology. He said in Chinese, 不争论, 3 words, just stop it, just stop it. And instead, let us 发财, let's become prosperous. And he said for his doctrine for the rest of the world, 韬光养晦绝不当头, which is, hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. And this was set in concrete for the 80s, 90s, noughties, and the most recently concluded decade as well, or at least a part of it. Xi Jinping changed that strategy. He changed it in and around 2013, 2014, at major conferences of the Communist Party dedicated to China's foreign policy work. Deng's doctrine was quietly buried. It was replaced by a new doctrine in Chinese referred to as 奋发有为, or striving for achievement. And he said very clearly that China will now seek to leverage its newfound power within the balance of power to change China's material external circumstances. Whether it was in the region, like in the South China Sea, or whether it was internationally by challenging the United States' preeminence in institutions such as the United Nations. And so China's national strategy under Xi Jinping has changed. That's been the second driving factor underpinning the overall dynamics now driving US-China relations. The third driving factor is the American response. As of about 2017, the United States abandoned a 30 to 40 year long strategy of so-called strategic engagement with China. Under that strategy, it was assumed and argued by its proponents, shared by governments such as mine in Australia, that by continuing to systematically engage China in the world and in the region, politically, strategically, militarily, economically, technologically, and in meshing China within the global economy and the global rules-based system, that irrespective of how far China grew in the future, it would become, to paraphrase the then Deputy Secretary of State of the United States, Bob Zoellick, become, quote, a responsible global stakeholder. It wouldn't change the rules of the system, it would simply become a more powerful voice within that system. And that was the overall argument underpinning decades of strategic engagement, including opening the doors to membership of the World Trade Organization to China in 2002, resulting in turn in China becoming, in the next decade or two, the world's factory, making everything for the world at a low price and of increasingly high quality. That policy or strategy of strategic engagement was abandoned formally in November of 2017 by then National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster. And instead it was replaced by a new doctrine of, quote, strategic competition, unquote. And its underpinning logic is this, that China, in fact, in the American assessment, is now actively competing with the United States to supplant the United States as the preeminent regional and global power. And as evidence, they point to what China had done to change the status quo in the region, not just in the South China Sea, but its continued pressuring of Japan in the East China Sea over contested territorial claims over the islands of Senkaku or Diaoyudao, depending on which language you use. And then, of course, greater pressure militarily and physically towards Taiwan, and rolling pressure in cyber and space. And across the institutions also of global governance, as well as in China's bilateral relations with many countries with whom America had had a long-standing strategic partnership. And therefore the contest became one, or the competition had become one, of who would emerge by mid-century as the preeminent regional and global power, and who therefore would become the nation state around whose geopolitical power the future rules of the international system would be constructed and the values upon which it would also be built. Would they be, quote, American values, or would they be, quote, Chinese values, driven out of a Marxist-Leninist system? So the American response to this phenomenon, as of November 2017, was to change its own strategic doctrine. And in the 5 years since then, what has been remarkable has been the extent to which Democrats and Republicans have combined to make this a bipartisan strategy in an otherwise utterly fractured American polity. And so with the election of the Biden administration, it doesn't matter whether we are talking about the China strategy released by Secretary of State Tony Blinken, the National Security Strategy released in September of this year by Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, or the new National Defence Strategy released by Secretary of Defence Lloyd Austin, or the most recent technology export bans released by Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce. The bottom line is there is now not just the articulation of something called a framework of strategic competition, it is being materially populated by concrete instruments of policy. For example, by banning semiconductor exports from the United States to China with a view to containing China's technological rise. And that came in on the 7th of October, only a month or so ago. If we put these three sets of dynamics together, therefore, what we see are the driving forces, the driving structural forces at play which are shaping the dynamics of the current state of US-China relations. Changing the balance of power, China's changing national strategy under a more assertive Xi Jinping, and America's response to that through its own strategic doctrine of strategic competition over the last 5 years. And so when we find ourselves buffeted on the waves in this country by this changing dynamic between the two giant elephants in the living room of geopolitics, namely China and the United States, that is why. And we are not alone. If we were sitting in a university hall in Seoul in the Republic of Korea, we'd be having the same conversation. Similarly in Japan. Similarly across Southeast Asia, similarly in Delhi. Similarly across Europe, similarly across North America, similarly increasingly in other parts of the world as well. We are not alone in confronting this dilemma. The question which I've sought to address in this book, The Avoidable War, whose subtitle is The Dangers of a Catastrophic Conflict Between the United States and Xi Jinping's China, is that when I began looking at how rapidly this US-China relationship was sinking through the floor, it struck me that it had become so dangerous that anything could happen any day. The analogy I used, and one which was picked up recently by the Chinese foreign minister, was along these lines. Imagine you're out here in the middle suburbs of Newcastle, and you've got two blokes down in the backyard whose hobby it is to engage in some backyard welding. They're in a shed, okay. And you go into that shed and you open the door, and the first thing you notice is that the welding equipment and the wiring and the cabling, which attaches it to the electricity mains, is all frayed. Insulation's gone. They're welding away with exposed wires. Next thing you notice is that the floor is awash with water. And the third thing you notice is that neither of them are wearing rubber-soled shoes. And there are sparks flying everywhere, and the question you put is, what could possibly go wrong? That's where we've got to with US-China relations. And I was sitting on the stage like this at the Asia Society in New York, where I'm the president, where the Chinese foreign minister was speaking at the lectern on the other side of the stage, where he used and referenced and quoted my analogy to describe how he saw the relationship as currently standing as well. Of course, he blamed the Americans. It's what I call unmanaged strategic competition. No rules of the road, no strategic guardrails, just day in, day out, push and shove to try and re-establish equilibrium, whether it's across the Taiwan Straits, in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, in and around the Korean Peninsula, or in the monumental volume of cyber attacks being unleashed each day. And what is happening in space with spaceborne satellites and spaceborne technologies, some of them with military application. And so the problem with that is when you have too much metal flying around, for those of you who are students of mathematics, the laws of probability start to kick in. Too much metal, too many deployments, too many ships, too many planes in a confined space, you are starting to look mathematically at the probability of an accidental collision or a non-accidental collision occurring. And the sorry history of international relations is that when that occurs, escalation unfolds. Unless you have the mechanisms or the guardrails present to manage that down. That is unmanaged strategic competition. And frankly, it frightens the bejesus out of me. Which again is why I wrote this book. And an earlier journal article in Foreign Affairs magazine in the United States at the beginning of the Biden administration, outlining my argument for what was then entitled in one of their lead articles as short of war. And what my book argues, and that article before it argued, is for a concept of managed strategic competition, which is to identify these 5 sets of strategic red lines: East China Sea, South China Sea, Taiwan Straits, Korean Peninsula, cyber and space, and for the two sides to be able to construct some basic guardrails around each of them, some basic rules of the road around their self-identified strategic red lines, and communicate those to the other side confidentially, so that each side is not on a voyage of daily discovery testing where those red lines might be before pushback occurs and an accident unfolds, and then we're in crisis, escalation, conflict and war. The second element of the concept of managed strategic competition is if you can achieve the first, then you should be able to define the other domains of the relationship as non-lethal strategic competition. That is, you can be out there striving as hard as you can, competing as hard as you can, across the economy, across technology, across trade, across investment, across aid and development, across the rest of foreign policy, and in fact across the rest of security policy and ideology, Marxism-Leninism versus the American notion of liberal democratic internationalism. And may the best argument win in non-lethal competition. And the third part of the concept of managed strategic competition is to have sufficient political and diplomatic space remaining for continued strategic collaboration in those areas where global public goods continue to exist, where it's in the national interests of both sides, China and the United States, and in the national interests of all of our sides for cooperative action to occur. Climate change is plainly the first cab off that rank, where you're looking at the world's 2 largest emitters, China and the United States. Similarly, global financial management, global macroeconomic stability, nuclear non-proliferation globally. Look at Putin and Ukraine and the threats of tactical nuclear weapons. Together with the next pandemic, given how much we royally screwed up the management of the last one. So in other words, dispatching the senior officials from both sides in order to craft such a joint framework, and in the first category of this framework, that the strategic guardrails I referred to before around the strategic red lines that I listed, for them to get cracking and to do that work. It doesn't eliminate the risk of crisis, conflict and war, but it reduces the risk of crisis, conflict and war. So let me conclude by talking about where we've got to in the last week or so with the summit between Biden and Xi Jinping, and relatedly between Xi Jinping and our own Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in Bali on the margins of the G20 summit. By the way, let me own some bragging rights. I'm glad I'm to be standing before you as a co-founder of the G20 summit, something we innovated together during the global financial crisis, and for the first time secured for Australia a place at the top global table. That was in 2008, 2009. And isn't it good to see our Prime Minister using this global forum that we constructed for these purposes to maximum advantage and to maximum effect? And had we not created this institution at summit level back then, in partnership with the United States, in partnership with China at the time, there would be no forum easily for these heads of government to meet each year in, shall we say, non-crisis circumstances. Can you imagine Xi Jinping or Biden voluntarily heading to each other's capitals for a summit? Too difficult. But if you have a pre-existing international summit which they have to attend, for example, the G20, then that provides the mechanism, the face-saving mechanism for both sides to be in one place at one time and to meet. So what was achieved between Biden and Xi Jinping? Literally last week. If you look carefully at the language used in the American readout of that meeting and the Chinese readout, both sides spoke about the need for the first time to stabilise the relationship, to begin putting a floor underneath it. That's progress, given that we've been falling through the floor for the last 5 years. Number two, the US side increasingly over the last 6 to 12 months has been picking up the use of language such as managed competition, strategic guardrails, in fact, forms of rules of the road in order to stabilise the relationship around red lines. On the Chinese side, slightly different language was used in the readout last week, but there was new language referring to the need to provide protections for the relationship to prevent crisis and conflict from occurring. Fang hu is the Chinese word. And as well, to have a new concept of a national security safety net underneath the relationship, an anquan wang. Again, a new word. And then on top of that, what you see is an agreement for the senior officials led by Secretary of State Blinken to go to Beijing to begin strategic communications, quote unquote, in order to achieve these objectives. The reason I attach importance to words is that within the Chinese political system, of which I've been a student now for more than 40 years, is that words issued by the leader in a Chinese Communist Party system dominated by a single leader, they matter. They are translated down the system. They authorise the officials to then go and do different things to what they've been told to do over the last 5 years. And so therefore, there is some, what I describe as reasonable glimmer of hope. Of course, it has to be seized with both hands, and we still don't know what the outcome will be. But the judgment I have reached is that for the next several years, what I call the short to medium term, both governments have walked to the edge, stared into the abyss, and decided it's a very long way down there. And because neither of them, given the balance of power, can be confident of overwhelming success in a military campaign, reinforced in China's mind, I think, by Putin's rolling military disaster in Ukraine, it's not as easy to invade another place than you might think, that these two countries, because of that risk, have now decided to resort to good old-fashioned diplomacy in order to establish a form of managed strategic competition. My words, not technically theirs. But that is for the short to medium term. For the medium to long term, we still face the overhanging challenge of Taiwan. Xi Jinping has made plain that what he calls the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation cannot be achieved in the absence of reunification with Taiwan. The great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, 中华民族伟大复兴, must be realized by 2049, which means we're already on a 27-year timeline to Taiwan, whether you like it or not. And that's not an eternity. If you think about where we were at the turn of the millennium, that was 22 years ago. It's not that far hence. And I'll certainly be gearing up for another run at the Prime Ministership then. So I'll be a sprightly 90-something-year-old, almost young enough to be President of the United States. So this still hangs over our head. And therefore, we are faced, therefore, with the practical challenge of being realistic in our recognition that from the late 20s into the early 30s, that if the military opportunity and the political opportunity and the financial and economic opportunity opens up for Xi Jinping to take Taiwan, that he will do so. And then the question for all of us is, what then does the United States do? How do they militarily respond? Do they militarily respond? And what expectations would then be placed on American allies in Asia as well? That's why I'm in the peace business. I'm in the deterrence of war business. And the challenge, therefore, for the medium to long term is to build a sufficient deterrence, militarily, technologically, financially, and in trade terms, as well as in broader foreign policy and politics, to cause Chinese leaders, by the time you get to the early 30s, to conclude that still the risk is too great of contemplating that possibility. And that is where we are up to. I'm glad that Albo met with Xi Jinping. We've had 6 years of silence in high-level, head of government level communication between the two sides, China and Australia. Never in the 50-year-long diplomatic history of this relationship have we had no speaksies for so long. 3 years of ministerial freeze. Never in the history of the diplomatic relationship over 50 years have we ever had that. It's good that we are back talking, because unless you are talking, nothing else can be dealt with as a matter of substance, either on the trade front or the human rights front, or any other front, including geopolitics. Next, in the next week or two, we will celebrate the 50th anniversary of Gough Whitlam's decision to recognise the People's Republic of China. Half a century. It's a long time. It was certainly all my sort of post-adolescent, in-adolescent experience of China in this country. And so it would be a good thing if our Chinese friends could find a way to use that anniversary to remove remaining trade sanctions, as well as to allow those who have been incarcerated, I argue, for political reasons in China, like the journalist Cheng Lei, to come home to her 2 little children in Melbourne. And was China able to do that, then we could get back in 2023 to rebuilding what I think is a strong, vibrant, respectful, mutually advantageous Australia-China relationship. I thank you.
There's your microphone.
Gee, it's dark up here.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin, for something that's so thought-provoking and and incisive and instructive. You mentioned at the end there that it's next month we celebrate 50 years since we established formal diplomatic relations with China. Gough Whitlam went to China in 1971. And over almost all of that time, as you noted, you've been central to our understanding of China. Your undergraduate studies in Taiwan with your honours thesis on human rights, your diplomatic posting in Beijing, 84, Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, Prime Minister again, and now Chair and CEO globally of Asia Society and other prestigious organisations. As you reflect on all of those years, what are some of the highlights of Australia's relationship with China?
You see, can you hear me okay? Good. Remember what it was like before 72. I can't, because I was a kid at school. But if we read the history books, that history was utterly adversarial. Mm-hmm. During the Korean War, you had Australian troops firing at Chinese troops coming across the Yalu, and the reverse. People often forget that in this country, but we've been at war with China once before, and it was on the Korean Peninsula between 50 and 53. China was also arming North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, which didn't conclude until 1975. And China, until, as you know, the late 50s, was part of a global communist monolith, together with the Soviet Union. And so that Cold War phenomenon, in all of its dimensions, sort of for several generations of Australians, was the overwhelming paradigm for looking at this thing called China. And then the lights went on. One small light was, let's call it the Nixon-Mao Gough light of 71-72, where the geopolitics was, how does China now work with the United States to offset the strategic pressure it then felt from the Soviet Union? And that was part of Kissinger's strategic vision. But the second big light went on when Deng Xiaoping replaced Mao's version of Chinese Leninism and Marxism with 40 years of reform and opening. What I remember most is being Hawke's bag carrier. I was a junior woodchuck in the Australian Embassy in Beijing, and my job was to do the advancing for Hawke's presidential visit. All of Hawke's visits were presidential, not just prime ministerial. And to two Chinese cities. One was in Chengdu, out in Sichuan, in the west of the country, and then in Fujian. So I remember two things. One is Hawke sitting down for lunch with his best bud, the then General Secretary of the Communist Party, Hu Yaobang, for lunch. And Hu Yaobang, in deference to his Australian guests, insisted there be no chopsticks, but that every course had to use separately a knife and fork. So there were about 20 knives and 20 forks either side of the plate. When Hawke turned around, he said, "Now, where's a bugger supposed to start here?" So that was a high point of Australian diplomacy. But it was a reflection of actually how intimate things had become. Then we actually went on to Fujian, and a province on the east, the one facing Taiwan, which would be right in the heart of the military sandwich if there was to be a war. And we went to a city called Xiamen in the southern part of the province on the coast, where there was a young vice mayor who I was working with in coordinating Hawke's program for what was one of China's first special economic zones in Xiamen. There were 4 at the time, which allowed foreign investment. And so we agreed that we were going to show Hawke what the new China looked like. And the vice mayor that I was dealing with was a young vice mayor called Xi Jinping. And so that was in 1986. And he went on to better things than I did. And so that was also an occasion where you saw these two leaders, hawky and full flight, and Xi Jinping near at the beginning of his own career, contributing something to the fabric of this long-term Australia-China relationship.
Kevin, we've had lots of wonderful questions from people who are here and all around Australia actually have submitted questions. We've had questions from faculty and students, community and high school students. One of the questions that's been asked is around history, culture and language. We know that history, culture and language shapes the way we think, the way we understand the world, the way we understand other people. In your book, you point out the relationship between China and the United States. Very readable and very, very worthwhile.
You can buy a copy outside.
You can buy a copy outside, yes.
$29.99 and if $29.95, and if you buy 10 copies, you get free steak knives.
But one of the things you talk about at the beginning of the book is the short history of the China-US relationship. And that's been a long and a tense at times and a contested one. And many people don't know, for example, about the Chinese involvement on the Western Front in World War I and the betrayal by the United States at the Treaty of Versailles. We've had a lot of questions around culture and language. Dr. Stuart McBratney, I think, is here and he asked a question. But this question comes from Dr. Bin Lee of the University Law School. And he's one of the initiators of this event. But Bin asks, as a statesman, why is it important to understand the bigger picture of history, language and culture in trying to resolve contemporary issues?
My argument is that the beginning of wisdom, whether it's in personal relationships or in political relationships or international relationships, the beginning of wisdom is to understand what the other person thinks and why they think that way, without making a judgment as to whether that is right or wrong to begin with. Now that takes a bit of time to understand why a person is saying what they're saying, what thought pattern underpins it, and what causes people to reach those conclusions, which is usually a combination of historical and cultural and sometimes familial factors. So it takes a bit of time. I think one of the reasons why I've had some success in engaging Chinese counterparts, and it hasn't always been easy. I've had my own disagreements with China, most of which have been documented. But I was taken to lunch just before COVID broke out by some senior Chinese leaders. And I thought, well, what's this about? I'm a think tanker in the United States. What do these guys want? And it was quite interesting. I don't know why they particularly did it on that occasion, because there was nothing blowing up at that particular time. They said, no, we just wanted to thank you for putting in 40 years of effort to understand our language. So, my God. Now, that doesn't mean, therefore, if you understand the language and the culture and the history, therefore agree with everything the Chinese government, least of all the Chinese Communist Party, put on the table. You don't. But by God, you can understand some context as to why they have particular views. What we often don't understand is that in a Chinese official lens towards the United States, the accumulated racism that Chinese migrants to the United States experienced, not just in the 19th century, but well into the 20th century. You know, there were multiple Chinese exclusion acts put into law in various US states and federally over many decades. And these became common knowledge across China, which even then was a relatively literate country. And so therefore this racial prism through which, quote, the white man looked at the Chinese people and the Chinese nation, it really leaves a deep scarring in the way in which these things are viewed. On the flip side, our Chinese Communist Party friends find it almost impossible to recognize the fact that most of the hospital and university institutions that had been created in China by 1949 were created by American missionaries. And they were perfectly well-functioning, not intensely religious, And still, if you go to Beijing today, the Peking Union Medical College was established by the Presbyterian Mission in China in the 20s, 30s and 40s, a lot of funding from the American Rockefeller Foundation, which, by the way, partly funds the Asia Society, of which I'm now president as well. So the Communist Party finds it all politically incorrect to say, well, these crazy Americans actually did some good things. And look at all this stuff that we've got, which is part of their legacy. Tsinghua University is another example of an enormous legacy of earlier investment by American educators and American missionaries. So this chasm of mutual non-comprehension, or as a Chinese friend of mine says, these two countries are condemned to a future based on mutual non-understanding. We have to begin to unravel.
In your book, you talk about multiple agreements and communiques between the United States and China regarding Taiwan. You also talked, and you mentioned today, about some of the impact of some of the issues that arose from the Trump administration. We've had many questions about Taiwan, including ones from Richard Berry and Ellen Dungerville, but this question comes from Gabe Flynn, a local high school student who's here today. And he says, why should Australia care about what happens in Taiwan?
Where are you, Gabe? Wave your hand at me. I was trying to stare at you through the mist. Okay. Great question. So thank you for the question. The reason why we care about Taiwan is this. Taiwan is a province of China which now has 25 million people living in it, same population as Australia, which in the course of the last 30 years has evolved phenomenally from being a military dictatorship to being a functioning democracy. It has also become a country in which, a province in which you have a phenomenally competitive and open economy, which produces the world's most advanced semiconductors for the global market, on which most of the things that we open and shut in our daily lives and the cars you drive will ultimately rest on a semiconductor manufactured by TSMC, the world's single most advanced supplier of advanced microprocessors, 6 nanometers, 9 nanometers, and now 3 nanometers. And also this place called Taiwan has become an enormously open and progressive society. I think to this day, the only country in East Asia with legislated laws protecting same-sex marriage. And this is all within 30 years that this transformation has occurred. And furthermore, all of our instruments of diplomatic recognition of China back in the 70s, for example, certainly recognised that China had sovereignty over Taiwan, but we all said, including the United States, is that we would only be prepared to support the formalisation of Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan by peaceful means, not military means. So none of us in this room, and never me, support the idea of an independent Republic of Taiwan or a totally independent political status. That's totally contrary to what we agreed to when we recognised China way back then. And that, for the Chinese, constitutes the big red line. So therefore, my argument always is adhere to the one China policy, but also at the same time say firmly to our Chinese friends, the only way you're going to get reunification with Taiwan with the support of the international community is if you do it by peaceful means. Otherwise, the Taiwanese will fight, and their military capabilities are about equivalent to those of Ukraine. That is, 1 million men in uniform and a highly trained militia and increasingly well armed by the United States. So whether we like it or not, this will erupt into a war if military force is used by China against it. They're the reasons why I think we need to care. And the further reason we need to care is to deter and to play our part in deterring China from ever considering that military option.
You spoke about in your talk about Deng Xiaoping and his amazing economic reform and growth which captivated and astounded the West. Open the windows, breathe in the fresh air, or the other famous saying, who cares if the cat is black or white as long as it catches the mouse. But as you point out, whilst the West welcomed this new relationship, they saw it as a transformational one. But from the very outset, China saw it as a transactional one. So we have a question from Zhuili Zhang. In your book, you suggest the US-China relationship is not a zero-sum game. It can be win-win-win. How can Australia avoid being caught in the middle of our strong strategic relationship with the United States and our absolute economic dependence on China?
Well, for 50 years we've walked and chewed gum successfully. And that's no small feat, although you would argue that there was mainly walking and no chewing gum by Morrison and Dutton, because it all went south pretty quickly, particularly in the last 3 years when we ended up with literally no speakeasies. And 6 years, 3 years of ministerial freeze, 6 years in head of government freeze. But for 45 years or so, we managed, governments, Labor and Liberal, to sustain a relatively balanced China relationship on the one hand, and a strong alliance with the United States on the other. Now, the material factors outside our own national circumstances, of course, have changed. The three underpinning sets of strategic variables I referred to in my formal remarks: changes in the balance of power, a more assertive China, and an American strategic response. So that's changing. So given our current circumstances, how can we do it? My own judgment is there are probably just 4 or 5 quick principles. One, put the megaphone away. And the great success of Prime Minister Albanese and Foreign Minister Penny Wong and the rest of this current Australian government is that they have legitimately concluded that the megaphone is useless in terms of solving problems. There are times when you do need to take a public position on a major international question, like a Russian invasion of Ukraine. But if you listen carefully to Morrison and Dutton, this would happen every second Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. when there'd be another attack. And of course the Chinese reciprocated. So the overall rhetorical overhang confronting the relationship was huge. It crowded out the space for a substantive diplomatic discussion about anything of substance. So that's principle number one, put the megaphone away. And for 6 months, guess what? Both sides have put the megaphone away. You notice that? There's no more shouting. Not a bad thing. Number two, from the Australian side, still being very clear with the Chinese friends that we believe in universal human rights. And we don't do it because we believe in American human rights or Western human rights. We believe in human rights as defined in international law under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, co-drafted by American, Chinese and Indian drafters at the time, led by Eleanor Roosevelt, and which China subsequently ratified together with Australia. So these are the universal principles which we've all signed up to. And therefore, you say to our Chinese friends, as I always have said, that's where we take our universalist position from. The Chinese still bridle at that. Third thing is, you say to our Chinese friends, unapologetically, because of our history and our circumstances, we remain allies of the United States. However, to our Chinese friends, we say that doesn't require that we have to conform with every element of US foreign policy. Look at Vietnam, look at Iraq. We, the Labor Party, did not. Fourth principle is maximise your mutual economic advantage and by maximising trade, investment and capital flows and resuming normal student and tourism flows in both countries, both directions. Finally, maximise our collaboration through the global institutions of global governance on climate and the rest, because that's in our combined interest to do so. And the final principle in Rudd's 6 commandments is is, I'm not Moses, by the way, is when you are going to take issue with China on something and disagree publicly, do so in partnership with a bunch of other countries. It always pays to hunt in packs. It's much easier to be taken out with a unilateral Chinese punitive action if you simply are one country sticking your hand up, as Dopey Morrison did when he called unilaterally for an independent global inquiry into the origins of COVID. Nothing wrong with the call. I'd written the same myself in the New York Times a week before that. But I also wrote that with 100 other former heads of government. Morrison went out on his own. Had he done so with the European Union and other Asian allies, the ability then for China to single out the Australian government would have been much, much less. And still to this day, we're suffering $20 billion annually of trade sanctions. So you ask how this is done. I think if you apply those sorts of principles to the challenges of the day, it's never neat, it's never easy, there'll always be push and shove. But I think it'll be much more stable than what we've been through.
Penny Wong recently suggested there were 3 layers to Australia's foreign policy. The first was set by John Curtin, the US-Australia alliance. The second by Evatt, who fashioned the international system constrained by rules. And the third by Gough Whitlam, Paul Keating and yourself about Australia's place in the region. And at the recent 20th Party Congress, she referred to the idea that it's time to usher in a new international system. A system that I think, in your words, is more just, more multipolar, and more respectful of China's power, values, and interests. Could you tell us more about what she means by a new world, a new international system?
I had dinner with Penny last night and I didn't ask her, so I've just come from Canberra. I haven't read that speech, so let me infer rather than say anything definitive. I think what Penny is referring to is the fact that against any matrix of power, the distribution of global power among states is vastly different to what it was in 1945 at the San Francisco Conference, which established the United Nations and the UN Security Council with 5 permanent members, each of whom have a veto. And in 1944 with the establishment of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, as well as establishing the World Trade Organization, then called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And so I think what she's referring to is the fact that this distribution of power has changed. And one of the reasons why we brought into being the G20 back in 2008-09, and there was a huge fight at the time, which will one day be written about more comprehensively, between Australia in one corner and the French in the other corner about whether this should be a G12 or a G20. The G12, by the way, would have excluded us. The French wanted to keep it small, more power for them if it's a smaller group. So you would have had the existing G7 and then adding on to it China, adding on to it India, adding on to it Brazil, and adding on to it a couple of others as well, but not their cobbers from down under. So, and we argued strongly for a G20. One of the reasons we argued for the G20 at the time is because it represented, in its totality, something like 90 to 95% of global trade. And therefore, it represented 95% of global GDP as well, by and large. And therefore, by that group in a room, you could begin to take decisions which would be representative of the reality of the global economy, and then, still requiring the full legitimacy of all nation states voting for it, bring such a proposal to the institutions of global governance, like the UN and the others, in order to be finally ratified. I think what Penny is talking about is accepting these realities. That is, that the global distribution of power has changed, while not throwing out the fundamental organising principles of what we would call a liberal democratic order based on principles of open societies, open governments, as well as open economies. The principles which underpin, for example, the engagement we currently have within APEC.
You talk in your book about the 10 concentric circles of interest of Xi. The first one is maintenance of power. Number 3 is the economic growth. China's growth has fallen down significantly, bumbling along at 1 or 2% at the moment. Its population is fairly stable. India is about to overtake it as the most populous nation on earth. If it hasn't already, it will do very shortly. Those seem to be somewhat in conflict. Economic growth, how does Xi ensure economic growth and rebuild it to the point it was where under Deng Xiaoping?
One of the reasons I wrote this little book, which you can get for $29.95 outside, is that it's got, is that I found myself being asked in many places around the world, what does Xi Jinping think? What's his worldview? What are his set of priorities? What does he want? And so these 10 concentric circles of interest, which I won't list all of them, are my attempt to construct what is Xi Jinping's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, from the most important through fairly important ones to those which are still important but less important. And number 1, as you correctly said, is keep power, personally and politically. Never forget, it's a Marxist-Leninist party. It obtained power through the barrel of a gun, through the People's Liberation Army, then called the 8th Route Army, the Balujun. And this party is not about to surrender political power. It looked what happened when the Red Army surrendered the Russian Revolution in 1991. And Xi Jinping is deeply scarred in his own worldview, as reflected in his own writings, by the collapse of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the implosion of the Soviet Empire. And so when I say stay in power, this is from a very much a Leninist frame. So it's big, as well as him staying in a paramount position of power within the party. You're right, to stay in power you need legitimacy. In our country, legitimacy comes from what we do in our democratic duty at the ballot box. The Communist Party doesn't allow you to use the ballot box, unless it's a supervised ballot box like Xi Jinping's the other day, when he managed to get reappointed by 2,280 votes to 0. There was one bloke who was wavering, but he's on a bus to Xinjiang now. And so if you don't have legitimacy that way, how do you have legitimacy? So legitimacy, as understood in the Chinese Communist Party system, derives from 2 things: raising people's living standards in a material sense, and the forces of Chinese nationalism, being proud of your country. So raising people's living standards has been the absolute cornerstone of political legitimacy for this system, really since the end of the Cultural Revolution and through the Deng Xiaoping period. And that's why Deng changed the formula and the growth model. As you said before, it doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white so long as it catches mice, or as I said before, buzhang lun. Let's stop talking about theory. Let's just enable people to escape poverty. And that was the huge enduring legacy of Deng. But also, over 40 years, given the devastation of the Cultural Revolution, rebuilt the party's legitimacy as well. So the ultimate social contract, if you like, between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party was, we, the Chinese Communist Party, are taking from you your political rights, and we're extending to you your economic rights to be lifted out of poverty. That's kind of the deal. And you're right, now he's changed the nature of the deal. And one of the things I begin to document in this book, and other stuff I've written more recently about the 20th Party Congress last month, is that what Xi Jinping has done in the last 5 years is change that economic growth model. And he's made it more ideologically conditional on the retention of power by the party, and he's become concerned about the ever-growing influence of the Chinese private sector. And so therefore there is more of an emphasis on party and state control of the economy, more emphasis on the constraints now to be imposed on the private sector, more emphasis to be put, in his worldview, on the future role of state-owned enterprises and on wealth redistribution in a way which is new. And so as a result, for those reasons and for the ones of demography you've pointed to, and of COVIDology, the zero COVID policy, growth has actually collapsed in the last couple of years. And when we talk about growth of 2 percentage points, this is something we've not seen since the military crackdown in Tiananmen in 1989. So that's more than 30 years ago. So where the analytical community is divided at present is whether he will course correct. I had thought that he may have tried to do so at the 20th Party Congress. But if you look at his work report of the 20th Party Congress, it doubles down on this more Marxist-Leninist view of the economy. But if we end up with 2 more years of negligible growth, or 3 years of negligible growth, with youth unemployment now sitting at 20% and rising, and a new Chinese phenomenon called tangping unfolding, which means literally lying flat, means I've given up trying to find a job, or I can't go and start a business anymore because the business environment is too parlous. I'm now tangping. Under those circumstances, there is an open question as to whether they'll be forced to course correct by 2 or 3 years' time, or whether Xi Jinping will be forced by others to do so. An open question about which there's no conclusion yet.
Kevin, Robin Considine from the Newcastle Institute says, we don't hear much about Chinese domestic politics, but just because we don't hear about it doesn't mean it's not real. Can you tell us about Chinese domestic politics?
Yeah, God, how long you got? It's my first job in the embassy way back in the Mesolithic period, when I was first secretary, was Chinese domestic politics. And so in those good old days, what you had to rely upon was each day's edition of the People's Daily. And you would read it assiduously in Chinese from top to bottom, look out the placement of the articles, whose names were most prominent, whose names were least prominent, were they changing from one edition to the other. And the reason we did that is because that's how the Chinese Communist Party reads those papers, because there are 96 million members of the Chinese Communist Party, a little more than live in Newcastle. And so think about almost 4 Australias equals the total membership of the CCP. So the way they communicate is through ideological texts with each other, which is why we analyse these documents really carefully. So let me summarise where I think Chinese domestic politics has gone under Xi Jinping in 2 or 3 sentences. For 10 years now that he's been in, he's moved politics towards the Leninist left. More power for the party, more power for him within the party. Less dissent within the party, and certainly less dissent and freedom outside the party. Number 2, he's moved the centre of gravity on the Chinese economy, as I just said before, to the Marxist left. Less room for the private sector. And thirdly, he's moved the dial on Chinese nationalism more towards the right in support of a more assertive Chinese foreign and security policy. The last thing to be said about Chinese politics is the really surprising thing about the 20th Party Congress, which concluded last month, was that normally in these congresses, which brings together all the factional groupings, the loyalty groupings, across the entire machine together in one Congress which lasts a full week every 5 years. Normally what leaders do is try to produce a leadership slate, or as we would say in this country, ticket, which kind of balances things off. You know, you've got people from the, folding chairs and artichoke management faction. You've got, people from whichever group. Xi Jinping didn't do that. He took winner takes all. And those who were remnant members of a previous faction in support of liberal economic reform, led by current Premier Li Keqiang, were all dropped from the Central Committee and therefore will be dropped from the Politburo, have been dropped from the Politburo and will lose their state positions when the National People's Congress convenes in March. And instead of those 3 individuals, 4 more have been put into the Standing Committee of the Politburo who are long-standing personal political loyalists of Xi Jinping. So you need to understand that this party is now stacked at its most senior levels with his strongest supporters. And that is both, if you like, a strength in terms of his Machiavellian craft, But as we all know, that if any system so concentrates power, inevitably you're going to set up forces of reaction against it over time as well.
I'd like to mention the Asia Pacific Research Centre. This centre, I think, provides, it's part of the College of Human and Social Futures here at the University of Newcastle, and it provides an important platform to facilitate mutual and beneficial understanding. I'd like to finish with a question that you asked Henry Kissinger just a month or so ago. If you were in the office of PM Albanese or were a counsel to Xi Jinping, what would you be saying to them now in order to further stabilise our relationship, and perhaps not just stabilise, but ensure ongoing mutual understanding, cooperation and benefit?
I think what I would say to both Xi Jinping and to President Biden, because they're the two principals here, of where this whole roadshow goes, is take seriously the idea and the concept of managed strategic competition. Give your senior officials 6 months to develop 5 sets of guardrails around the 5 red line issues which any day of the week could otherwise trigger a war, and give them a report back time frame so it doesn't drift on. In order to deal, for example, with what may be an American breakout again soon, with the prospect of incoming Republican House Speaker Kevin McCarthy visiting Taiwan, replicating the visit by Nancy Pelosi from the Democrats just a few months ago, throwing us potentially back into the sort of vortex that we were in before. And the practical application of, let's call it the Taiwan-related guardrails, if the Chinese can pull back their military activities to their side of the median line within the Taiwan Straits rather than flying over it at the moment, causing Taiwanese jets to scramble every day, that would be a practical early example of what you could do. And I think the last thing I would say beyond the short to medium term is that for the medium to long term in providing effective deterrence, for the United States and its partners and allies around the world, including the Taiwanese themselves, it's coordinating to the point that you have an effective set of military, financial, economic, as well as foreign policy and political deterrence, which causes our Chinese friends to think twice about the military option. And for the Chinese themselves, I was saying to Xi Jinping about Taiwan, one country, two systems has basically been dealt the death knell because of the repression in Hong Kong over the last several years and the application of China's new national security law to Hong Kong. I think what will be required is a new and much looser formulation for the future, maybe what I would call one country, three systems, which is a notional idea of a wider confederation between Taiwan and the mainland, rather than a unitary state whereby Taiwan province would have to yield to anything or everything that Beijing had to say. But that would be very much a work in progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rudd, and thank you, Robert, for a fascinating discussion. It's quite humbling and amazing to be around the power that you bring of knowledge, information, and hope. I have a few final notes of thanks to share with you before I close our proceedings, beginning, of course, with our guest of honor. Dr. Rudd, thank you for your wonderful lecture and compelling take on the future conflict. It was a compelling take on how future conflict might be avoided in our region, and I hope for the young people in the audience and watching online, you gain hope from this discussion about the opportunity we have to change the direction of the rhetoric of the last few years. It was a privilege to hear from you on this important if daunting issue, and we certainly hope world leaders heed your advice and continue on a path of restraint, strategic competition, and dialogue. I thought of just a few short words of my summary of your amazing intellect and the wonderful history you bring to this that's just impressed us all this afternoon. The price of freedom is truly not free. I think of the two-front war my father fought in. He landed at Nagasaki a few days after that second bomb that hit Hiroshima and the one hit Nagasaki. And he restrung the telephone poles, as many Australian and American and other allies did, to try to put communication back in China. He was part of, as many of your elders were, the greatest generation. I was trying to think where we situate ourselves to that generation. They protected a two-front war against Germany and Japan. I wonder if we're not in the three-front war, and I may be oversimplifying your hundreds of pages, but the first is to protect democracy, which you spoke of so well. That's really on the line here. Freedom, both domestically, internationally, and of the free will that we have as free people. The second is protecting the planet, and you spent good time, and the book spends good time talking about the impact of climate change as another front that we're going to have to win. The option is really not viable. And the third is protecting our humanity. Wherever you live, whoever you are, that we share one race, the human race, and we got to protect our elders and our children and provide hope and opportunity, inspiration. You've done that for us today, and we're deeply grateful. Many world leaders try to build walls. You're a bridge builder. And I think that's one of the messages I take. In our own organizations, as we play a role as citizen of planet Earth, building bridges is better than walls. On behalf of the University of Newcastle, I want to thank you for delivering our inaugural lecture. I'd like to invite our Vice Chancellor back to the stage to present to you with an artwork. Dr. Rudd, this artwork is from one of our local Aboriginal artists, an alumnus of our university, Nicole Chaffee. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Dr. Rudd. It's an extraordinary picture. Yeah, we have to have a selfie moment. Please indulge the Vice Chancellor. All right. Alex, thank you both. I'd like to also extend our appreciation to our wonderful co-host, Robert Loken, and the Newcastle Institute. Robert, thank you for facilitating such an engaging conversation. Your knowledge and interest in this topic actually made this conversation a masterful work of art. It was an honor to be part of. Thank you so much. There are many good people working behind the scenes here at the university to organize this event. We'd like to recognize our teams from the College of Human and Social Futures. Christy and your team run a first-class, world-class event. Thank you to all our technical staff and the people behind the scenes who pulled this off. To marketing, communication, security, infrastructure, facility services, the Office of the Vice Chancellor, all of you did a tremendous job in making today happen. And to Frank for helping to initiate this, we owe you a debt of gratitude. Thanks so much. Thank you also to Auntie Donna for being with us today and giving us the beautiful acknowledgement of country. Remember, we're standing on the elders' shoulders here today, and we owe them a debt of gratitude to overcome the inequities to our Aboriginal brothers and sisters and elders, past and present. We thank Professor Frank and the Asia Pacific Research Center, Dr. Bin Lee, one of the key instigators for the idea of making this happen. And we thank all of you for attending today, whether you're in person or online, for joining us. We truly value the participation of our community in events such as this, and we hoped you enjoyed the opportunity. On the way out, reach out to someone you might not know, start a dialogue. I think Dr. Rudd has challenged us that talking is better than arguing, and we have a shot to save the planet if we do. Thank you very much for coming today.